Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. I am your co-host, Derek Kelly, and of course with me is Tara Holwegner.
Hi, everybody.
And we are back for another episode, and this is going to be the second time, Tara, now that we were welcoming
That's
in
right.
Jeff Nevenhoven, who is a senior consultant right here at Lifecycle Engineering.
Hey, Jeff, welcome back.
Hey, Tara. Hey, Derek.
Thanks for coming back, Jeff. And so, yeah, if our listeners remember, or if they've actually listened to it, but back in May, we had Jeff on the first time, and we were talking about the ADKAR model. Mm-hmm. So this whole change
Which is
topic.
a change management, yeah.
Yep. So, and we are going to welcome him back to talk something similar. So we're still talking about change. The title of this episode is called Managing Change, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back. And Tara, you know, I will tell you, it makes me think about Paula Abdul. She had that hit song.
Hello, 90s.
Yeah, she had that hit song. Okay, I'm a millennial.
Two steps back.
So Jeff wrote this article a while back, but it's a very important topic, and I think it's one that, you know, people often when they lead these initiatives, these change initiatives, they think they're going in the right direction, but there's just something they haven't planned for. And so it causes them to kind of revert back. And so we're going to kind of walk through what Jeff means by that title. And so the first thing I want to do really quick, Jeff, is one more time, can you just give us a little bit detail into your background and kind of what led up to you working here at LCE?
Sure, Derek. And it was a great segue there. Speaking of the 90s, that's about the time frame there I started my professional career in manufacturing. I remember getting started there, learning about standard work and working with teams, continuous improvement, quality assurance, really kind of helped build the foundation of where I'm at today on those core practices. But I moved forward from that and stepped into the world of maintenance and reliability as a service engineer and began working on equipment right out there on the factory floor. And after about 6 years of that, I landed myself in a position where I was overseeing a maintenance department. And while I knew how to work on equipment, I really didn't have any background or knowledge on managing maintenance. So I found this company called Lifecycle Engineering and went through some training classes about 18 years ago now, and learned about the best practices in warehouses and planning and scheduling and reliability and all those activities related with maintenance and reliability. Went back to my plant and it started to implement change. And I'd like to say that I did it right, but in all honesty, I did it wrong. 3 years into it, we made some good progress. We got out of a reactive mode and was more proactive, but it was really a person-dependent type of change. And when I stepped away to go on to another job opportunity, that change reverted and went back to its old way. So I learned a lot during that time frame, but thankfully, Lifecycle Engineering asked me to come on board about 14 years ago. And ever since then, I've been passionate and excited about helping organizations implement best practices around reliability and maintenance, but also making sure that they take into account the human side of it and do that effectively, not make the mistakes that I made.
That's a great story, Jeff. I think it leads us into our next question because it sounds like you are describing taking a step forward and then two steps back. So explain to me why you chose that title, One Step Forward, Two Steps Back.
The title, became quite obvious to me one day, and I had thought back over several change initiatives. And I can actually go back to that very first time in this organization where I was a maintenance manager and driving home every evening, banging my head against the steering wheel, wondering why I was even trying to do this because I wasn't making any progress. But then on the way in the next morning, I'd be fired up and ready to go again and try to move the needle forward. At the time I wrote this article a couple years ago, I was working on a large-scale initiative, and it was spanning multiple years. It was a 2-year program. And the first year, we were making good progress, but we got into year 2, and things started to slip backwards. And it kind of came unnoticed. It caught us by surprise in some ways, and in other ways, some of it didn't. But it was one of those stories, again, where change happens sometimes slowly, and there's steps that go backwards, and then you have to get up again and try to move it forward, and you move backwards, and then you move it forward, and you keep trying. So that's where the name came from.
So, Jeff, in your article, you talk about the unexpected forces that slow progress. And that's no matter how much time planning or assessing and implementing you do. Highlight some of the questions that are sometimes asked in that situation. What are some of those questions that people kind of get asked when they're dealing with that kind of difficult situation?
When I think about the specific change that we were undertaking at the time that I wrote this article, to put some context and framework around it, it was a 2-year journey. Year one, we were going down the path of implementing change. We expected some resistance. I think we would have been foolish if we didn't. We expected not all business leaders and sponsors to be fully on board, but we planned for those types of things, and we were working tirelessly to engage employees, to engage leaders, and move forward. And progress was being made. There was nothing that really kind of caught us off guard. But when we got into year two, those unforeseen forces that really caught us by surprise was the business market with the industry we were working in. And the influences that drove decisions and behaviors and changes in policies was something that we really had not sat down ahead of time and thought through proactively. So here we were with the project team, with focus teams who were also working alongside us trying to enact and enable the change. And now all of a sudden we're seeing sponsors not sponsoring, not even attending meetings. They were starting to get more and more pressure from their peers out in the workplace about why were they doing this when management was starting to contradict what the new program was trying to instill. There was a lot of challenges that way. And it manifested itself in unexpected areas. And there was a lot of folks coming back to us as the project leaders helping them. How do we deal with this? What do we do about that? What do we do when we show up to a meeting and our new process states we should be doing work this way, but the plant manager steps in and says, I understand that, but we're not doing it that way. And those were some very tough and challenging times when we were going through this change process.
So, quick question here, and I'm just not used to dealing with these situations, but can you ever plan for the unexpected, though? Isn't there always going to be something that maybe you haven't planned for?
Yeah, I think it's, if we had a crystal ball, we'd obviously know the future and we could plan everything out accordingly, but that's not the case. We don't have those crystal balls.
Sure.
But we can sit down and think about all the possible scenarios. And if I think about the change that we were on during the time of this example here, we probably should have sat down and thought through some things, what could happen out in year two. We were sitting there probably in the beginning looking a little too narrowly focused, too short term, and thought about this first year and what could possibly happen. Not thinking about if something were to change in the world business place in year two, how could that influence us? So I would encourage listeners to really, take that time up front and due diligence. And even though some things seem maybe far out there or kind of crazy, put them on the table and at least talk through them. Have some kind of contingency plan prepared just in case those unforeseen forces surface.
So I think it's a very terribly interesting conversation we're having about the technical aspects of a project, which is, what needs to get done, what's in the project plan, what are the technical aspects of whatever change that you're trying to do, the actions that need to be taken, and then the people side, which is the stakeholder analysis and the risk analysis. As a project manager, you're going to assess some project risks, but if you're talking about what you're talking about, Jeff, which is the people side of risks, then one thing that we can count on is resistance to change. So we do have to think about and project what are the people risks to this project, and how can I try to anticipate what kind of resistance and how that might manifest.
Exactly. And that is our challenge in change management. And that's really what change management is about, is managing resistance. We don't always put it in those words, but if everybody accepted change whenever it happened, every time it happened, we wouldn't have to do anything. But the natural tendency for us is that when change is imposed upon us, we can almost guarantee some portion of the population is going to resist it to varying degrees. So we really need to sit down and think through how that resistance will manifest itself and where it will manifest itself and when it can manifest itself. What would be those different triggers? And that's where I like to work with project teams and leadership teams early on to start thinking through that. in all reality, we have years and years of experience with change, whether we recognize it or realize it or not. Companies have undergone change for many, many years. And if they actually take time to sit down and kind of think through those changes that occur today might have a new name, might have new players involved, but a lot of times the human dynamics are the same and those same drivers are there. And if we can think through how people responded and reacted in the past, it's very likely they're going to react and respond the same way in the future. And past experience does drive how people respond to change. And that's why a lot of resistance happens, is that people have had a bad experience sometime in the past. So the information's there. It's really about kind of sitting down and thinking through it, but not just at the onset of a project. A good lesson learned through this 2-year initiative is that we probably should have had more regularly scheduled evaluation points to kind of do reviews to see where we're at and what was happening with the employee. So I would highly recommend doing that as well throughout the life of a project, not just at the beginning.
So let's compare this to an asset lifecycle, because we are on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. So let's bring this back to maintenance and reliability, where everything should live anyway. We have the DIPF curve in maintenance and reliability, which is getting ahead of and considering how you design in reliability and actually how you can design out faults, because you can't maintain yourself to a reliable state. You have to actually have reliability designed in. So how could we connect that to the people side of our projects of change? I think what I'm hearing is like, let's design in our plans for what kind of resistance we think we might get. And then let's carry our resistance management or change management, stakeholder management, whatever you want to call it, throughout the life cycle of the project, which could be years.
Right. And that's important, where at the onset of a project, when you begin to define the change and understand how change is going to impact employees, that's where we can start to, design in those activities to help employees adopt the change more quickly, better utilize it, and become more proficient at it. And those activities include things from communication, from active and visible sponsorship, to managing resistance, coaching out there in the field, and getting feedback and soliciting input from employees along the way. And there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You need to scale those activities and, as you said, Tara, design them in appropriately, because not every change is created equal. And you might even find that there are some areas of your business or organization that's receptive to the change and very little needs to be done. And then there's other areas we might have that require a more heavy hand on leading change as well. So sitting down with the project team and business leaders early on and really understanding the impact of change on employees will help direct then the level and duration of change management activities we need to undertake throughout the life of the project.
I know you kind of already said one lesson learned. For our listeners, just to conclude all this, if you had 1, 2, 3 pieces of advice of all the lessons learned, what would you say to listeners?
I think the biggest thing we need to be honest with ourselves is that, with change, it involves people, and not one person is the same as another person. And we just need to go into that and be prepared that change is fluid. And especially in change that's going to happen over a long period of time, you need to really look beyond the short term. I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned that I and the team that I was on took into consideration as we move forward into other projects, is to look beyond the obvious and look into year 2, look into year 3, and think through those potential risks that could come into play. Because like in this project, we had employees who were on board. We were making those steps forward. But then year 2 came along. There was influences that came into the business that changed policy and practice. Where all of a sudden now, those folks that were there, they were leading the charge, now became resistant. Not seeing that really created some problems that we weren't ready for in that year 2. So that's one of the key takeaways is, look beyond the short term if it's a long-term project. Also, be prepared to step in proactively at the first indication of resistance happening. You need to really get leadership calibrated and help them understand and see what's happening as well. Because whether we want to admit it or not, managers and leaders in organizations are employees too. And they get impacted by change just like frontline employees, and they have to go through the change process themselves as well. For us to expect them to be, if I can say, bulletproof to change would be unfair. So we really need to make sure that those people we are counting on to lead change, we're right there alongside them and helping them through the change transition as well when these unforeseen forces come into play.
And you know what? I'm just going to say this as we wrap up this episode right now, is that I think, and Tara, you can tell me if you agree with me or not, I think he's done Paula Abdul proud.
I definitely say that. Are we opposites attract? Derek? Is that how we ended up on this podcast?
I think so. And but I will tell you, to our listeners, of course, in our show notes, we're going to have a link to Jeff's article that kind of runs through exactly what we just talked about. We're going to have a link also, as we always do, to his LinkedIn profile. So connect with him, ask him questions on this subject. We won't actually put the link for Paula Abdul's song on there, but you can Google or YouTube that, and so you can see what we're kind of talking about. But no, seriously, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us for your second episode here in the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. And I'm sure this won't be your last time. Hopefully not.
Thank you, guys.
Absolutely, Jeff. And to our listeners, we ask that you please go to iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, wherever you may be listening to us from, and click that subscribe button so that you get updates for all of our new upcoming episodes. And we also ask that you rate our podcast. That gives us indication if we're doing well or not. And we're always open to more feedback. So if you want, leave a comment on some possible future topics. So once again, thank you for joining us on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast, and we'll catch you in 2 weeks. Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's 2 ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.